Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Carthage Razed again, early Muslim expansion by kings and generals. So, at the time of recording, this is the most recent episode in Kings and Generals early Muslim expansion series. As I've said repeatedly, when they release more episodes in this series, I will react to them, so I will keep the series going, but from now on, it'll probably be at a lower frequency because obviously I can only react to them when they get released. Now, there are other videos that Kings and Generals have released on the early Caliphate that I'm going to react to. For example, slavery in the early Caliphate, and some other videos that you guys have recommended in the comments. If you have other videos on this topic that you want me to watch, please recommend them so that I know they exist and I can get to them. That's just a bit of a disclaimer of where we'll be going from here on, but stay tuned. We've got plenty of content coming, both about the early Caliphate and many other topics. So, back to this video. Carthage Razed again. Poor Carthage, they seemingly cannot escape this fate. I'm excited to watch this one. Presumably, since we're talking about Carthage, we'll be going back to Muslim expansion into Roman territory in North Africa. I'm excited to get into this one. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
In our previous video, the second Fitna saw the Umayyad Caliphate struggle through years of bloody civil war, emerging shaken but intact. Today, the armies of the Caliphate return to the frontiers, clashing with the crumbling Byzantine Empire in Armenia and North Africa. In the latter, they would not find opposition just in the Roman remnant, as the rise of a new warrior queen among the Berbers posed a serious challenge to Hassan ibn al-Numan's conquering army in the Maghreb.
Oh, interesting. I don't think we've seen too much of the Berbers so far, but of course, they're a people that have been around for a while and have been influential for a long time in that region. So I'm excited to see what they're getting up to. I assume that the Byzantine Empire will continue to take L's, as has been going on for a long time at this point. I mean, they've been taking L's at the hands of the Caliphate for decades. And as they said last time, we saw the dominance of the Umayyads, though it took years for them to fight back and wrestle back control of their empire, though they managed to do it.
And even as the Umayyads won victories on the battlefield and expanded ever further, the cohesion and unity of their empire continued to deteriorate on their eastern frontiers, planting the seeds of their eventual collapse.
Okay, so the Umayyads are going down eventually. They reasserted themselves, but it seems like it's not going to be enough. Because, since the first Fitna, the Caliphate has really not been unified. There's been so much chaos, political infighting, 2 civil wars at this point. I do wonder if down the line there's going to be another family or another dynasty that's able to unify the empire once again. I suspect that'll probably happen. That's how empires go, usually.
Better to plant a tree instead, eh? And you can do that while expanding your realm at the same time by using our sponsor, Established Titles.
Very true. So, as I always say, please go and check out Kings and Generals' video. It's linked down below. Go and check out their sponsor. I've got their link on the screen right now. Basically, go and show them some support for making these fantastic videos.
And help support the channel. Following Ibn al-Zubayr's death and the surrender of his forces at the end of an 8-month-long siege of Mecca, the immediate aftermath of the Second Fitna would see Caliph Abd al-Malik dispatch armies to suppress the Kharijite uprising.
I was going to say, that's sort of the elephant in the room. The Umayyads have managed to gain their empire back, take control of the Caliphate once again. But one, we know their control is still a little shaky, and two, if you notice, right in the middle of the map, the Kharijites have a pretty significant amount of territory that they're still holding on to, even past the end of the Second Fitna. So that's going to have to be dealt with.
That had been such a thorn in his would-be usurper's side. The Kharijite army ruling Yemen and Central Arabia had already begun to fragment and dissolve even before the Umayyad victory in the civil war, with their leader, Najib ibn Amir al-Hanafi, having been executed by his own disillusioned forces
Yikes.
over his supposed secret negotiations with the Umayyads.
No one can keep themselves together, huh? Every force, every family, every dynasty, every political faction that we see eventually crumbles apart. I suppose that's just the way of the world. But in this last couple of decades, there seems to have been a particularly high amount of that chaos.
Many of the Kharijites dispersed before the Umayyad reconquest, making for Persia or North Africa. With that said, the Kharijite remainder, led by Abu Fudayk, put up staunch resistance to General Umar ibn Ubaydallah's Iraqi army when they met in battle in Bahrain, driving back the Basrans making up the Umayyad left wing and seriously wounding Umar. However, they were held at bay by the Kufan right wing and the Syrian cavalry making up the center, then driven back to their camp when the Basrans rallied and returned to the fray. With the wind at the Umayyads' backs, the Kharijite camp was set alight, with the smoke and heat panicking horses and reducing the Kharijite defense to chaos. With Abu Fudayk slain on the battlefield, those of his followers that remained fled to the fortress of al-Mashaka, but with no relief or reinforcement coming, the walls of the ancient fortress did little more than entrap them. Lacking supplies, surrender came swiftly, and little mercy was shown. The mass executions.
Yeah, we're past the era of mercy. You know, when we go back, and both I and the kings and generals have mentioned this before, if we go back to the first fitna, particularly in the early years, we see, you know, these Muslims, whether or not they're on different sides of the issue, they're in different political factions, do not want to murder each other. They don't want to murder their fellow Muslims. They had a lot of restraint. You know, in the first fitna, there's a lot of negotiations so that they wouldn't have to fight each other. Now, fighting still occurred, but they really didn't want it to come to that. But because of that fighting and the chaos that followed, at this point, years down the line, a lot of that mercy is gone. A lot of that hesitancy, Muslims not wanting to fight and kill other Muslims, is gone. They're willing to fight, kill, and massacre. We've seen several brutal atrocities dealt in the second fitna, and that trend continues.
Of most of Abu Fudayk's followers, ending the brief period of Kharijite dominance in Arabia in a grisly fashion. Though Kharijites still held sway in parts of southern Persia and would be behind further uprisings in the future, this would be their last major bid for power within the caliphate. A more serious challenge to the reunified Umayyad realm would come in the north, with the breakdown of the peace treaty with Byzantium. Under Emperor Justinian II's leadership, the Byzantines had not been entirely uninvolved in the caliphate's civil war.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, you've got these two empires right next to each other. If one is going through some internal conflict, you know the other one's going to get involved. And also, it's completely unsurprising that, they've failed to adhere to this treaty. We've got, the Byzantines, the Roman Empire, the remains of the Roman Empire, this long and storied empire, which is trying and over time failing to prevent the collapse of their empire, trying to hold on to the territory that they have. And you've got the Caliphate, which is this young, dynamic, expanding empire. Of course they're going to come to blows. Of course they're going to come into conflict. It's basically inevitable.
Extorting tribute from the Umayyads, and even taking control of Armenia from the Zubayrids. They also backed and supported uprisings of Christians within the divided caliphate. In the Nur Mountains, where Anatolia and the Levant meet, the Mardarite community had risen up along with thousands of escaped slaves in 688, launching raids into Syria and forcing the overextended Umayyads to make even greater concessions to quell a threat uncomfortably close to their seat of power.
Yeah, and I mean, the Byzantines are using tactics that have been used against them. They're fomenting uprising and chaos in another empire. This is stuff that the Byzantines often have to deal with themselves. And of course, you have to remember, a lot of this territory, they've tried to reassert their control over Armenia. I'm sure they want to reassert their control over a lot of this territory that they have recently lost in the past couple of decades. It hasn't been long since, the Romans held a lot of this territory that is now held by the Caliphate. And of course, there's still going to be a lot of Romans there and a lot of Christians there. So it's sort of this interesting interplay we have going on right now.
Though no major battles were fought, and it is unlikely this Byzantine involvement greatly impacted the civil war's course, Justinian II was able to secure a great deal of tribute, and, more importantly, the Mardarites themselves, who were relocated to regions of southern Anatolia left depopulated by Arab raiding to help rebuild the Byzantine power base.
Yeah, Anatolia has really been ravaged over these last, couple of decades. There's been a lot of Muslim raids in the region. I imagine a lot of the people there have either been killed or they've cleared out. They've went elsewhere, or maybe they've fallen under the control of the Caliphate. They're now in Caliphate-controlled territory. So the Byzantines definitely need to repopulate and rearm that region, especially because Anatolia, it's such an important region to the Romans. I mean, it's the Byzantine heartland. You've got Constantinople, and on one side we've got the Balkans, the other side we've got Anatolia. So some really important, territory, basically.
However, while the relocation of the Mardarites was a major economic boon for the flagging Byzantine Empire, it also removed an obstacle from the path of a renewed Caliphate offensive after the Civil War's end. Surprisingly, despite the favorable terms of the 689 treaty, it was Justinian that broke it and made the first move, attempting to regain full control of Cyprus and its revenues after decades of shared ownership. This action could be seen as a defensively minded
shared ownership of Cyprus between the Caliphate and the Romans, fast forward roughly 1,500 years, 1,400 years until the present day. Cyprus, let's just say there has been a lot of conflict over Cyprus in the modern era. So Cyprus, it's still being wrestled over.
Preemptive strike, with Justinian expecting Abd al-Malik to break it as soon as his strength was replenished. Or Justinian may have simply underestimated the Caliphate's strength, hoping to secure even greater concessions after a battlefield victory. Either way, the renewal of hostilities quickly backfired for the Romans. Though precise dates are unclear, the later months of 692 saw two clashes take place: a smaller army of 4,000 invading Armenia under Uthman ibn al-Walid, and a push into Anatolia by the bulk of the remaining Umayyad armies under the Umayyad prince Muhammad ibn Marwan, a younger brother of the Caliph. Both generals achieved victory, thanks in part to the defection of thousands of recently conquered Macedonian Slavs Justinian had attempted to force into his army.
I mean, this is not surprising to anybody, or at least I don't think it is. More Byzantine losses to the Caliphate. This is just commonplace. If I see Byzantine troops getting into a battle with Muslim troops, my immediate assumption at this point is, the Byzantines are going to lose this one, and probably lose some more territory while they're at it.
These twin defeats undid years of Byzantine expansion and negotiation, leaving Armenia firmly under Arab control and Anatolia open to renewed Arab raiding in the following years.
It's crazy because Armenia is a really ancient kingdom, by the way. I mean, it's existed for a long time. And for a while now, hundreds of years, it has sort of been within the Roman sphere of influence. Oftentimes, earlier on, you had an allied Armenian king who was buddies with the Romans. So there's been varying extents of Roman control over Armenia, but it's been within the Roman sphere of influence for a long time. And now, like a lot of Roman territory that had been held for the Roman Empire, whether it be the full empire or just the Eastern Roman Empire for hundreds and hundreds of years, it's been taken by the Caliphate.
On the home front, Abd al-Malik worked aggressively to consolidate power in former rebel strongholds. A figure of central importance during this period was al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, who rose to prominence as the leader of the Caliph's personal forces and became famous for his keen military mind. Following the Second Fitna, he was rewarded with the governorship of Yemen and the Hejaz, a major display of Abd al-Malik's trust for the general, given the lingering anti-Umayyad sentiments in the former Zubayrid power base. Though only in the position 2 years, al-Hajjaj swiftly reasserted Umayyad control through harsh, unforgiving leadership and displays of force that both helped cow the rebellious nobility of the Hejaz and allowed Abd al-Malik to demonstrate his mercy through occasional more lenient interventions. Leaving Arabia behind in...
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a good way if you're the big man in charge. In this case, the Caliph, or in other cases, the Emperor, or whatever position of power. If you have a brutal general like that, who's doing all these terrible things, you can make yourself look really good by occasionally saying, wait, I pardon these people, don't murder them. And then everybody goes, wow, look at our great Caliph, or look at our great Emperor. He's so merciful. When, I mean, in reality, this is your general doing all of this stuff. But it's a good PR move, at least.
694, he was sent next to Iraq, taking over as governor of Basra and Kufa from the Umayyad prince Bashir ibn Marwan, and working to reassert
he's moving up. He's getting the important territory now.
control over a fractured and rebellious Persia, where he would soon find himself on the front lines of another rebellion.
Wow.
Meanwhile, on the western frontiers, expansion was beginning anew. While the Caliphate had been the dominant power in North Africa for decades, the continuing Byzantine presence in Carthage left their hold over the region tenuous at best. Additionally, outside of fortified cities such as the aforementioned Carthage and Kairouan, the native Berbers held effective control of most of the Maghreb, with different groups entering into alliances with either the Caliphate or Byzantines based on shared religion or political expediency. So as long as the Byzantines represented an opposing power bloc, they could forge alliances with Berber kingdoms and tribes that had not yet converted to Islam, and back native opposition to the Caliphate's expansion.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, this is one of the few regions where the Romans are still competing with the Muslims. If we go back to the Middle East, there's very little competition now because the Caliphate has taken a lot of the territory that was once Roman. Now, they're still doing raids into Anatolia, but the borders are more set in stone. Versus in North Africa, it's still a lot more permeable. There's still a lot of competition between Byzantine and Muslim power. Though, if the Muslims really, put some effort in, if the Caliphate sends resources and troops like it's doing, they can definitely take it. I mean, we've seen the Byzantines struggle to maintain control over basically all of their territory, so I wouldn't be surprised if the Caliphate is now about to snatch even more territory out from under the Roman Empire, or what remains of the Roman Empire as it is slowly crumbling. Honestly, if you were just watching this series and you had no knowledge otherwise of the history of the Roman Empire, the history of the Byzantine Empire, you would definitely be forgiven for thinking that, in another 100 years, well, the Byzantine Empire is probably going to be completely gone. I mean, it's not going to survive. When, remarkably, it's got another 700 to 800 years under its belt. I don't know how it made it that long. From this, you would really think that it was going to be gone quite soon, though it will continue to lose territory, of course.
To finally stamp out this threat, Abd al-Malik dispatched Hassan ibn al-Numan with 40,000 Syrian, Egyptian, and converted Berber soldiers in 694 to capture Carthage.
And once again, I think this is worth noting, we're seeing, and I mean this was true for Rome, this is true for any sort of empire, as the Caliphate expands, both the civilian population and the soldiers are getting more and more diverse. At one point, when we were looking at the very early Caliphate, it was all Arabs. It was all these Arab tribes coming together. But now you look at this force, it's a diverse group of different ethnic groups, different peoples who have converted to Islam under the banner of the Caliphate. So that's an interesting change, and that's an important change, definitely.
Initially, the invasion met only success, with the city's fleet and garrison abandoning Carthage for Sicily before Hassan's arrival in early 695. And allowing the city to fall without resistance.
Wow.
Hassan had more enemies in North Africa than he knew, however, Following the death of King Caecilius, or Kusaila, to the armies of Zubair ibn Qais, a new ruler had emerged to reunite the Berber kingdom Zuhayya had shattered. Known as Queen Dia to the Berbers, she was called Al-Kahina, the Oracle, by the Arabs, with rumors of her future sight a mark of her strategic prowess. As Dia united many Berber groups across religious lines in
Interesting, a Berber queen. I can't help but think back on Boudica with the Britons resisting Roman incursion. Now we have another warrior queen resisting, foreign occupation, basically. I wonder how she came to power. I wonder what gender roles were like within Berber society. How were women looked at? What roles were they, able to possess? This kind of thing makes me curious of the dynamics, and also makes me curious how she rose to power. Maybe we'll learn a little more about that, or maybe some of you guys know, or maybe we don't know. We might not have the sources to give us that sort of information.
opposition to Hassan's advance. She entered into an alliance with Constantinople, cemented by her marriage to a Greek husband.
Oh, okay.
Learning of Dia's prestige and determined to suppress Berber resistance, Hassan swiftly departed Carthage to march against her in Algeria, seemingly expecting another easy victory. Instead, when he engaged the large army Dia had raised near Bakaya, he saw the previous year's progress rapidly undone in a shocking military defeat.
Wow.
The precise details
Yeah, you're not fighting Romans anymore. The Berbers, they can actually resist. I'm not saying the Romans can't resist at all. Of course, they can, but we've seen Roman loss after loss after loss, and finally the Caliphate comes up against some non-Roman, but Roman allies, the Berbers, and it seems like they're doing a better job of protecting their territory.
of the so-called Battle of Meschiana, named for the shallow river valley the two armies clashed in, are rather unclear, though it is known that even among converted Muslim Berbers, a sizable portion favored Dia's cause, chafing at the inferior treatment non-Arab converts within the Caliphate's military received, just as the Persian converts of Iraq had during the Second Fitna.
Yep, I was literally going to just mention that. I'm glad they brought it up. This ties back to what I was just saying about how all these different ethnic groups being brought into the Caliphate, it makes things more interesting, makes them more complicated. We saw how the Persian conscripts were upset for being treated as lesser than Arab Muslims, even though they were converts, they were Muslims. They felt they should be treated fairly, the same as their fellow Muslims, whether they be Persian or Arab. We're seeing the same thing here. Some Berbers are fighting against the Caliphate because they feel they're being treated unfairly as Muslims. They want to be treated once again the same as Arab Muslims, but they're not getting that treatment. It's really interesting. And it does kind of show, to a certain extent, the limits of how much of a unifying factor religion can be. I mean, we've already seen the limits in the several civil wars where Muslims have fought against other Muslims, regardless of the fact that they have a common faith. Now we're seeing that ethnicity is getting in the way. Different ethnic groups are being treated differently, even though they share a common faith. It really goes to show how different identities can be important, and how different identities can sort of interact to create interesting political situations and political problems. Every empire's got to deal with this. The Romans absorbed many different ethnic groups as they expanded. Different empires have different ways of dealing with it, so it's just interesting to see it in this context.
The defection of Berbers in Hassan's army, before or during the battle, could go some distance towards explaining the defeat of his larger and better armed force.
Yeah.
Though whatever the cause of this disaster, the stung Hassan would abandon the campaign to await reinforcements in Tripolitania, not to challenge Dia for another 5 years.
Wow.
He did, however, clash once more with the Byzantines during his retreat, who, under General Absimar, had recaptured Carthage by sea in a surprise attack while Hassan had been marching against Dia. This time, Hassan took no chances. After years of Byzantine resistance and fleet activity out of the city, he chose to raze
Another Byzantine loss.
Carthage to the ground, as Scipio Africanus the Younger had centuries prior.
Jeez, man. Of Carthage seems to have quite the tradition of being completely destroyed. It's unfortunate. It's a city with a great history, a great legacy, tradition. It's unfortunate that, it's now been razed to the ground twice by two different empires. Hassan following in the tradition of Scipio Africanus.
Conclusively ending the Byzantine foothold in the Maghreb and stripping Dia of a crucial ally. For his part, rather than continue the resistance in North Africa, Apsimar commandeered the Carthage fleet for a voyage to Constantinople, where he overthrew Emperor Leontios and seized the throne as the new Emperor Tiberius III, compounding the internal strife and instability that had already weakened the Byzantine resistance over the past years.
Shows you how vulnerable and unsteady the Byzantine Empire is, that a general can sail back to Constantinople, kick out the current emperor and crown himself. Now, I'm not sure about the particular circumstances of this situation, but we see this a lot throughout Byzantine history, upstart generals seizing the throne for themselves. It's really not too difficult. It happens many a time. Shows you sort of how, I suppose, flimsy and vulnerable the Byzantine political system was, though it must have had some endurance to it since it survived for so long. But they certainly did not have stable succession in the empire. Succession was always basically a disaster.
Accompanying these temporary setbacks in the west was a new breakout of rebellion in the east. The Hephthalite-descended Zunbil kingdom of Afghanistan was proving a formidable roadblock to Governor al-Hajjaj's expansion attempts, and the first campaign against them in 698 ended in utter failure when Ubaydallah ibn Abi Bakr's army was lured into the heart of the mountainous kingdom, cut off from retreat, and destroyed.
Damn.
The greatest threat to al-Hajjaj and the Umayyads would not come from the Zunbils, though, but from the general sent to lead the second invasion, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muhammad ibn al-Ash'ath. When he attacked the Zunbils in early 700, they fell back without battle, abandoning large swaths of their territory to the invaders. Fearing the same trap that had doomed Ubaydallah's army, al-Ash'ath opted not to push on into their mountainous heartland, planning to consolidate his conquests and continue cautiously expanding over the years to follow.
It does seem like the Caliphate is now facing more of a challenge from smaller, less established enemies, small kingdoms, tribal enemies, rather than, the massive Byzantine Empire, which cannot manage to defend its own territory. These smaller kingdoms, or these smaller empires, are having actually a better job fighting back against the advancing forces of the Caliphate than the Byzantines are.
But when al-Hajjaj learned of this, he accused Abd al-Rahman of cowardice, demanding he complete the conquest of the Zunbils before he or any of his men would be allowed home to Iraq. Here, the harshness he had so often shown while subduing the Hijaz would backfire, as the soldiers in Abd al-Rahman's army, wary of the danger ahead and angered by their poor treatment, opted to follow Abd al-Rahman back to Iraq to depose al-Hajjaj rather than pressing on into Afghanistan as ordered.
Yeah, so this is the thing with someone like al-Hajjaj. Sometimes it's good to have a leader like that, a general like that, who's brutal and who's willing to do what it takes to get the job done. But you also make a lot of enemies that way. And you need to make sure that you don't go too far, you're not too brutal, or you're going to face an uprising like this, which, really isn't good for anybody, especially if you're the Caliph, So it's good to have someone like this on your staff, but this can cause some issues down the line, as it is right now.
Reaching an accord with the Zunbils, promising them tribute exemption should he be victorious, in exchange for safe haven should he be defeated, he began his march west through Persia, defeating al-Hajjaj's loyal commander, Atiyah ibn Amr al-Anbari, in a series of cavalry engagements along the way. At this point, Abd al-Rahman's rebellion was strictly targeting al-Hajjaj, and no threats towards Abd al-Malik or claims for the title of Caliph had been made.
Interesting. So that is interesting. So, this is still bad for Abd al-Malik, but this is more a squabble between two loyal generals, apparently, who are both loyal to him but have issues with each other. I'm curious to see how he handles this, if he gets involved, or if he just lets it play out.
But after receiving word of the mutiny, Abd al-Malik opted to back his unpopular governor, sending several thousand experienced Syrian cavalry with all haste to Basra to reinforce him.
Alright, he's sticking with this man. I suppose he must know the consequences. He's willing to back up his guy who got him into this situation, and now Abd al-Malik is going to help al-Hajjaj get out of the situation.
In a last-ditch effort to turn back the rebels, al-Hajjaj sent 2,000 of these new arrivals to block the mutineers from crossing the Dujail River in the lowlands of Khuzestan. But while they initially saw success against a 300-strong advance force, the rebel army, raised and outfitted for conquest and certainly outnumbering the Syrians, even if the reported strength of 100,000 is a clear exaggeration.
We have a lot of exaggerations from this period. There's a lot of exaggerations from ancient history in general. Caesar's a big culprit of this. But, holy moly, from looking at Muslim history, we have a crazy amount of exaggeration from the sources. Anytime there's a significant force of warriors, it's always like, yeah, so this is 80,000 guys, this is 100,000 guys. But most of the time, we're talking more like 10 to 30,000. That's more what we're talking about. But we're 3xing it in the sources. Like I said, this is common in a lot of ancient sources, of course.
Soon forded the shallow river, forcing their way across and putting the Syrians to rout. In the aftermath of this clash, the rebels expanded the scope of their movement, now disavowing Abd al-Malik and seeking his overthrow.
Okay, so I was wondering, actually, did Abd al-Malik backing his general sort of interfere with the rebel movement? You could imagine that taking steam out of their movement, because if they're still loyal to him and he's backed the other guy, well, that's a problem. But instead, this rebellion has evolved. It's taken the next step to keep its momentum going, which is now it's a full-on rebellion against the Caliph.
Along with that of al-Hajjaj. It is possible Abd al-Rahman had intended this from the beginning, and simply used the battle as justification. But whether this was the case or not, he now represented a major threat to the overextended caliphate, with so much of Abd al-Malik's core Syrian army away fighting in North Africa. Arriving in Basra in February of 701, after al-Hajjaj had fled north towards Kufa, Abd al-Rahman took advantage of the departed governor's unpopularity to secure oaths of loyalty from much of Basra, fortifying the city and engaging in a month of skirmishing with al-Hajjaj's forces before sallying forth to do battle in mid-March. Initially, the Iraqis held the upper hand. Though the two armies met in the open, al-Hajjaj's loyal forces, drawn from the Qurayshi and Thaqif tribal confederations of the Hejaz and the Caliph's Syrian reinforcements, were soon forced to retreat to the defensive trenches they had prepared to foil the enemy's cavalry charges. Fierce fighting took place for most of the day, with the spearmen on al-Hajjaj's flanks falling back in disarray and the center on the verge of rout. But on the very brink of defeat, an unexpected charge by Sufyan ibn al-Abrad al-Kalbi, leading the forces of Syria's powerful Kalb tribe.
It always comes down to a cavalry charge, particularly with the Caliphate. They've got a lot of, it all started from the Arab tribes coming together, a lot of particularly talented cavalrymen, and that tradition still sticks. These cavalry charges can really turn the tide of the battle, as we're seeing here.
One of the few to remain loyal to the Umayyads at the start of the Second Fitna, impacted the Iraqis' right wing, the trench fighting breaking up formations and confusing their defense. With the pressure lessened, the Syrian and Hijazi forces rallied, splitting the Iraqi army in two and setting them to flight. Abd al-Rahman immediately retreating north with the Kufan soldiers and most of his cavalry, while one of his lesser commanders, Ibn Abd al-Muttalib, led the Basran forces in a 3-day fighting retreat before finally escaping al-Hajjaj's pursuit and taking off after his departed general. But despite this defeat and al-Hajjaj's subsequent recapture of Basra, Abd al-Rahman's mutiny was still a major concern for Caliph Abd al-Malik, especially once the people of Kufa rose up to depose al-Hajjaj's loyal overseer, Ibn al-Hadrami, and offer Abd al-Rahman.
Everyone's just on a knife's edge. It seems like everybody in the Caliphate is ready to revolt at the sign of any sort of momentum. You see a rebellion going on, well, all the cities in the region rise up. We're mad. Yeah, a lot of, well, it's not really surprising. We're now at the year 700, the dawn of a new century, but for the last few decades, there's been an incredible amount of chaos and political infighting, so it does make sense that everyone is kind of on edge.
And their support upon his arrival. A year later, when al-Hajjaj marched north again after pacifying Basra and receiving further Syrian reinforcements, he found a greatly bolstered rebel army awaiting him outside Kufa. With both forces now wary of a decisive engagement, they each entrenched themselves on April 4th, 702, with weeks of low-intensity raiding and probing attacks following.
We're also seeing the use of trenches, which I feel like we haven't seen too much of so far. I mean, we've seen encampments, but now we're seeing some serious entrenchments, defensive warfare playing out, a lot of infantry forces and archers. This seems like at least from my perspective, a bit of a development from when we were before, in which it seems like in earlier years, the Muslim combat was more offensive in nature, more based on offense, aggressiveness, and far more cavalry-based, with a lot less of these sort of defensive maneuvers that we're seeing here.
This drawn-out exchange favored the Iraqis, who could easily resupply from Kufa, while al-Hajjaj's army struggled to feed itself in the unfriendly territory. And when word of the ongoing stalemate reached Abd al-Malik, he went as far as offering to remove al-Hajjaj in exchange for peace. Yet, surprisingly, Abd al-Rahman and his companions chose to refuse this offer.
I guess it's gone too far. That's what happens when you have a rebellion like this. Initially, it was just about this one brutal general. But now it's spiraled out of control. It's a straight-up rebellion against the Caliph. So when Abd al-Malik is like, hey, I'll remove him. It's not a big deal. Too late, it's already gone too far.
His army redoubling the pressure on al-Hajjaj's trenches with daily attacks. This back-and-forth skirmishing between the trenches continued until mid-July, though the morale of the rebels began to flag after the death of their cavalry commander, Jabala ibn Zayd. With no quick victory in sight, some of Abd al-Rahman's commanders began to question the wisdom of refusing the Caliph's peace offering, with some possibly reaching out in secret to the Umayyads in hopes of receiving pardons for their defection. When the two armies finally came together again in pitched battle on July 15th, both armies held firm through the fierce fighting until midday, seemingly evenly matched. But like in the previous battle, it would be a charge by al-Kalbi that decided the outcome, rushing out with his cavalry from behind the
Hey, this guy, he's really getting some achievements here. He's turning the tide of battles.
Syrian right wing. He attacked the Iraqi left wing under the command of al-Abrad ibn Qurra, a leader normally noted for his bravery. Here, however, Ibn Qurra fell back in retreat almost.
Of course, the question instantly arises, was he one of the guys who contacted the Caliph about a pardon? Normally known for his bravery, could have been he had an off day, could have been he was feeling particularly cowardly that day, could have been a million other things. But it also could have been that he had just contacted Abd al-Malik saying, hey, can you pardon me, if I ditch this whole thing or if we turn this rebellion around? And so he was getting himself out of there to take advantage of that. But maybe, right? We don't know.
Most immediately, leading to unconfirmed accusations in some accounts that his desertion had been negotiated with the Umayyads before the battle.
Of course. I mean, it's way too suspicious not to think that. That's immediately what you're going to go to. We'll never be able to confirm if it's true or not, but that's the thing that your brain immediately thinks.
With the collapse of the left wing, many in the rebel center began to flee as well, despite Abd al-Rahman's best efforts to rally a defense. After an impassioned call to arms from his pulpit, his commanders and some of the retreating infantry flocked to his side for a last stand. With the tide of battle now firmly in their favor, the Umayyads simply showered him and his defenders with arrows, rather than charge the well-defended trenches. With his position besieged and the battle lost, Abd al-Rahman fled east to the safety of the Zunbils, marking the end of his attempt on the caliphate.
Well, another rebellion. This one failed. W for the Umayyads.
back in the Maghreb. Though seemingly unchallenged following her victory at Mesquiana, Dia unwittingly planted the seeds of her own downfall by embarking on a scorched earth campaign in the territory she had driven Hassan from. Likely viewing the Caliphate's renewed invasion as simply ambitious raiding, she may have hoped to dissuade them from returning by stripping the border regions of plunder, or to demoralize them further after their defeat with a display of brutality.
Not good. Look, the Caliphate certainly has a tendency to raid. They love to raid border territories. They've been raiding Anatolia for years now. But also, these are not the Arab tribes from 60 years ago, right? This is another era. This is a different time. The Caliphate is in it to win it. They are an empire that wants to expand, and they want to hold the territory that they're expanding into. So even though they do like to get up to a bit of raiding every now and then, we're beyond that. Dia seems to have perhaps misunderstood that, or maybe just made a miscalculation, unfortunately. But, these Muslim forces, they're not coming to just raid Roman territory. They want to conquer and govern Roman territory. It's more serious than just raiding. And we have seen the evolution of that throughout this series. That's a very interesting change. And that's why the Caliphate has become such a strong empire. It wants to hold and govern this territory. They've been unified, which the Arab tribes were not before. Islam brought them together and allowed them to conquer and govern instead of just raid as a bunch of separate tribal confederations.
Unfortunately, this move would quickly backfire. For many under Dia's banner, especially those who lived in the affected lands or used them for grazing, were angered by the wasteful and self-destructive action.
Yeah, look, these are just civilians, not to mention that I bet a significant chunk of these civilians, I don't know how many, but a significant chunk are probably also Muslim. And even those who aren't, they're just trying to live their life. And they're not connected to imperial politics way out east, whether it be in Constantinople or in the Caliphate. They just want to live as peacefully and as well as they possibly can, especially in this time of violence and chaos. So if Dia is raiding their farms and burning stuff, then a lot of them are going to say, you know what, we'd probably be better under the Caliphate. Bring them back, right?
And without the immediate unifying threat of the Caliphate, Dia's Berber kingdom began to fragment. As these events are filtered through the interpretations of non-Berber outsiders, it is even possible the fragmentation had begun earlier, and what Arab observers saw as a scorched earth campaign was in reality an attempt to stamp out brewing tribal rebellion. Thus, despite her massive victory in battle, Dia would never reach Kairouan as her predecessor Caecilius had, with her dominance of the Maghreb reduced to little more than her homeland in the Auris mountain highlands by the time Hassan returned with reinforcements in late 702. Dia mustered what loyal forces remained to her, picking an advantageous battleground to await Hassan's arrival.
Look, winning battles like these, it's more than just being a good leader in battle. It's more than just being a strong fighter. You have to be able to unify people. You need to court public opinion. You need to inspire people to fight for you. You need to be a good leader in general. And it seems like Dia perhaps struggled with that, at least in this second go-around. Or maybe there was some sort of rebellion going on. This is the issue with our sources in this time period, particularly when we don't have sources local to the region. We don't exactly know. But seems like she's at a pretty big disadvantage at this moment.
Barca, on the coast north of the modern Tunisian city of Jendouba, where the Auris Mountains and Mediterranean Sea formed a natural choke point.
Once again, we're back to more traditional style of warfare for at least the Arab Muslims and a lot of people in that region, including the Berbers. Seems like these forces are almost entirely made up of cavalry. Well, if I was judging by the squares, I'd say 100% cavalry, but I'm sure that they're not 100% cavalry. But I was just talking about how in the rebellion back east, the warfare had sort of developed a little bit. We have archers, defensive maneuvers, more infantry, but this is more what we're used to, just these cavalry battles.
The choice of the battlefield was sound. The terrain would constrain and hamper the numerically superior Muslim army, while the presence of the Byzantine fleet at Sicily prevented Hassan from simply bypassing the choke point by sea.
Okay.
Nevertheless, when the battle was joined early in 703, Dia would see first her army and then her kingdom shatter, with no more Byzantine gold to sway tribes to her banner, and with her actions having alienated most of the lowlanders. Many of those who had fought with her at Miskiana deserted her or chose to join Hassan.
Yeah, this is an instance of where her political actions have gotten in the way of her military victory. Now, we don't know the whole situation, so I can't necessarily judge her as a good or bad leader. It's hard to tell, but it seems like the actions she took off the battlefield have now led to a loss against the forces of the Caliphate, a loss on the battlefield. Really shows you how important those things can be. You know, this is why someone like, Belisarius was such a good general. He was a good leader militarily and politically. He could do both. And that led to a lot of success for him.
Now that the Caliphate was the only remaining power bloc in the region. Though she narrowly escaped the disastrous defeat, she was pursued into the Ouris Mountains and slain soon after, ending the years of back-and-forth fighting to conquer the Maghreb. To aid in the rebuilding of the devastated region after Carthage's razing and Dia's scorched earth campaign, thousands of Coptic Christians were resettled from Egypt, taking up residence in newly founded Tunis to work in Hassan's new shipyards for the growing caliphate. In a cruel twist of irony, though, Hassan would not get to enjoy the spoils of his great victory any longer than Dia had, as a dispute over jurisdiction with Abdulaziz ibn Marwan, governor of Egypt and brother to the caliph, ended with Hassan losing his hard-earned governorship and returning to Syria in disgrace and poverty scarcely a year later, while Abdulaziz...
Disgrace and poverty. This man had it all. He was an important conqueror of the caliphate, and he seems to have just lost it all. That's pretty unfortunate.
expanded his own power on the back of Hassan's success by installing his loyal servant, Musa ibn Nusayr, in his place.
And now, by the way, if you just look at the territory, there's no way that the Romans are going to be able to hold on to this, because look how divided their territory is. They hold parts of southern Italy, Sicily, parts of central and northern Italy, but they're competing with the Lombards. Even look back in the Balkans, they don't even hold all of that territory, and that's far closer to their heartland, Constantinople. So there's not a chance that the Romans are going to be able to hold on to the rest of Africa, the rest of North Africa. Their supply lines are getting stretched. Their empire is getting stretched thin. They really cannot defend what they currently have. And over time, we're going to see them lose a lot of that western territory, the extricate of Africa, the western provinces, the Italian peninsula, Sicily. Eventually, all of that's going to go away because Constantinople really can't hold on to it.
It was Musa, not Hassan, who would push west to the Atlantic coast in the following few years, converting and assimilating most of the Berber tribes in his path, and waging war against those that refused, finally standing poised for the next great conquest of the ever-growing caliphate, Visigothic Spain.
Wow, okay, I didn't think we were going to get there so soon. I've been asking throughout this series, I wonder when the caliphate is going to extend all the way across North Africa. Seems like we won't have to wait that long.
In the east, meanwhile, the unrest sparked by Abd al-Rahman's rebellion would continue for years, with his former companions splitting up and raising later uprisings in Sistan and Khorasan, even after the Zumbils caved to the caliphate's demands and executed him. Iraq and Persia would remain centers of anti-Umayyad discontent, and Afghanistan unconquered for the rest of the Umayyad era, with the same racial and sectarian tensions that had fueled first al-Muqta's and later Abd al-Rahman's rebellions, eventually leading to their downfall.
Wow.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Established Titles. Buy a small...
All right, once again, shout out to Kings and Generals, their sponsor, their video. Go check it out. It's in the description. I really enjoyed this one. I'm also really excited for the series to continue. I want to see the rest of the conquest of North Africa and, the Caliphate's encounter with Europe. Now they're hitting Visigothic Spain. It's interesting because if you look in the Middle East, the furthest, closest to Europe they've gotten is Anatolia. They haven't yet reached the Balkans. And so, sort of their first contact with that world is going to be the Visigoths in Spain. So that's going to be really interesting. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and please check out the Patreon, which is linked in the description. You can get exclusive videos by checking that out. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.